He admired the clarity of the day, the castle on the hill upstream, the sun on the buildings across the river, and on the trees that hid the many large houses of the city's bankers and the heirs of the Florentine merchants. Retired musician, acclaimed cellist, his name for decades synonymous with the instrument and with playing at its finest, Fortuny was a distinguished figure, the most distinguished on the street. As a very young man, he had once seen Ezra Pound crossing a large square in Venice, his distinctive black felt hat and his dark coat wrapped about him like a cape, as he had headed towards the Accademia. For an old man, the poet had carried himself with unmistakable dignity, and Fortuny had raised his hat in brief salute, murmuring, "Maestro," but not loud enough for Pound to hear. As he had replaced his hat, the poet had swept up the wooden bridge and across the canal. Fortuny had resolved then that, when he reached a certain age, he too would wear a black felt hat, a dark double-breasted coat that wrapped about him like a cape, and carry an ebony walking stick. Now, at the age of 62, he stood by the wall in his hat and coat, the stick not yet required. People passing on the footpath glanced at him, not only because of his clothes and distinguished air, but because of his bearing. He looked noble, and indeed he was. Fortuny was not from Florence, but from Venice, and his aristocratic lineage could be traced back to the early days of the Doge. His ancestors, a minor line that had entered the Lista d'Oro in the late 14th century, after buying their nobility at the end of the wars with Genoa, had travelled as far as Cyprus in the service of the Republic. The name had always been the same, except that in the early days it had been spelt with an I at the end, like, Fortuny was fond of saying, Foscari. The family, before acquiring its noble status, had made its money from trade. They had been merchants. Peppers from Egypt, wines from Naxos, even cotton from Limassol. And over the centuries, the family had served La Serenissima in various ways, but mostly in civil administration and trade. In Chania, Nicosia, Famagusta. It had often been dangerous work, so much so that, when the Turks had finally conquered Cyprus, 4 family members had been lost in the space of 1 year. 2 had been disemboweled in the street, 1 decapitated, and another flayed in the sunshine, his skin later stuffed with straw, and the body paraded headless about the town. Fortuny still recalled his grandfather telling the story and, to his father's annoyance, laughing that the life of the modern public servant was never so colourful. But the family survived. That occasion marked its most serious brush with extinction. After news of the deaths reached Venice, the only surviving son was dragged from his monastery and married. The union produced 5 sons and 3 daughters. In later life, his job done, he returned to the Order of St. Francis, and later died in a small monastery on a hilltop overlooking Florence. In time, the new shoots were once again directing the Republic's trade in the Aegean, the Adriatic, and the Mediterranean, especially Corfu. There were whispers of Jewish blood, of curfews, of extended family members being forced to make their way back to the ghetto by nightfall. But by the time the French converged on Venice, the Republic had fallen, was sold off to Austria, and the family was once again on the verge of bankruptcy. They refused state charity, adopted the French Y to the family name, and fell back on imports and exports. Over the years, the profits were siphoned into real estate so that, by the turn of the 19th century, the family members managed to survive and maintain the style of living they had come to regard as their birthright. And all from the spices, wines, and cloth that had paid for their nobility in the first place. It was Fortuny's grandfather Eduardo who broke the family tradition, having no feeling for